From the University of Alaska Anchorage, this is Seawolf Voices, a podcast about the pathways to and from education. I'm your host, Matt Jardin. Finish high school, go to college, get a job. That used to be the pathway to professional success, but there may be an added fourth step, attending graduate school. According to a report by Encoura, 94% of graduate students are pursuing their degrees for reasons related to career advancement. Additionally, a paper by the Economic Journal found that employers view workers with graduate degrees to be 30% more qualified than those without. Sharing her experience and expertise on the subject is Tiffany Creed. Born and raised in Alaska, Tiffany earned her Bachelor of Arts in Film from Portland State University in 2013, followed by her Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing and Literary Arts from UAA in 2018. Today, Tiffany is the Communications Specialist for the UAA Graduate School, where she manages outreach to those thinking about pursuing a graduate education. In this episode, Tiffany talks about the many outcomes of a graduate degree, the real-world applicability of an interdisciplinary studies curriculum, and why you should never disqualify yourself from an opportunity. Tiffany, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Can you explain what is a graduate degree, but especially in the context of an undergraduate degree? Because before I graduated high school, I knew going to college was a thing and getting a bachelor's was a thing. But other than the context of getting an MBA, I didn't really know what a master's was until much later. So can you talk a little bit about what exactly a graduate degree is?
Yeah, definitely. So a graduate degree is an advanced level of higher education that you pursue after completing a bachelor's degree, whether that's a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science or a BFA, a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and then you said you have a BBA, a Bachelor's of Business Administration. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So after you have a baccalaureate degree with an accredited university or college, could even be internationally, you are permitted to pursue a graduate degree. So that includes master's degrees, PhDs, and then certificates. And then another type of degree that's post-baccalaureate but not a master's degree would be, well, I guess I'm being redundant, but it's a post-baccalaureate certificate, or sometimes a teacher certification can be a post-baccalaureate. But if my understanding, maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, graduate degrees are distinct from post-baccalaureate certifications. But UAA offers certificates, so graduate certificates, master's degrees, like a Master of Arts, a Master of Social Work, Master of Science, and others, and then also a PhD. And the way I look at it, partially informed by my own academic career, and then also my work with the graduate school, is that an undergraduate degree is sort of about a broader exploration of ideas. A lot of times people will have a specific major, but usually colleges have general ed requirements that are designed to have a wide, holistic sort of approach to a person's education, where they might require a certain amount of humanities courses, communications courses, in some cases a culturally relevant sort of course, or sometimes a math requirement or a science requirement. And so in contrast to that, master's degrees are supposed to be more kind of focused and specialized, and you're kind of diving deeper into a specific field and developing some of that expertise, and maybe even doing research or applying research or theories to real world problems. People might do that in an undergrad degree, but graduate degrees are supposed to be more specialized. In some cases, people are sort of just finding a new way to explore something new. That's what I did, because I studied creative writing, and I had a little bit of background in creative writing. But when I started, I didn't know what I was going to do. And by the end, I was even though I completed the degree, I still was sort of I don't quite know what I want to do yet. Or what, it was a process of becoming, and a process of finding, out more about where I want to go with things. Whereas some students in my program and others that I've witnessed as graduate school staff, they have a more focused and more decided that when they're done with it, this is what exactly they wanted to study, or it's just a little bit less like of a sort of, they might just have more of a specific goal in the end. And so, in sharing that, I'm just sort of saying that it's designed to be more specialized, but you don't have to have a specialized outcome or goal at the end to enter graduate school, because maybe in the beginning you're still trying to figure out what it is that you want to do. And so graduate degrees also sort of lend themselves to a career in academia. You're kind of learning how the academic system works, and maybe doing research or scholarship, or you might be a TA, so you can kind of like get some teaching experience under your belt, and you might be developing like a creative portfolio. So it's kind of like, it's, if you think of it like a funnel a little bit, your BA is the biggest part of the funnel, and then the master's is supposed to be the smaller part of the funnel that you're getting a little bit closer to your specific body of work in your specific discipline, and then the PhD is supposed to be just that much more narrow. With that said, I'm sure people find that each step can actually expand things, because isn't there an effect about like the more that you know, the less you think you know, or something like that?
Yes.
Is it the
So
Dunning-Kruger effect?
Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Dunning-Kruger?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I believe that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned learning more about academia when you're into your graduate program, because that is exactly what happened to me. Like it was 13 years after I got my bachelor's, and then I decided, hey, I should get my master's, not being really enthusiastic about it, because I was not a very good student during my undergrad. I mean, I passed with pretty good grades, but I was not the most dedicated student, partly because I just wasn't, I was in marketing, so I wasn't super passionate about it. It was mostly for career advancement, basically finding a job afterward. Not to knock those programs, it just wasn't for me, but I still did it. And I enrolled in graduate school just thinking it was going to be more of the same, more of a bachelor's level curriculum, but it wasn't. It was very much what you said earlier, like research focused. And I also did make a point of, okay, I'm going to go pursue a degree, a subject that I actually am really passionate about. So that definitely helps. But being able to kind of dive into it and research it and contribute to academia in that way has been so cool. And it has made me personally, like, I've been doing all of the graduate school stuff. Like I've been TAing, I've been going to conference, getting the things published, and being able to contribute to academia in that way. It's just been so cool being able to like see your work go out there and contribute into the wider field.
Yeah, that is awesome. And that actually kind of proves the point, maybe for some people who are considering it and they're feeling like, well, I had some missteps in my undergrad, and I
Mhm.
did too. I definitely had some missteps there. I think everybody does. I mean, typically because people it's their first time away from home,
Mhm.
or, if they're in the dorm, or it's their first time out of the K-12 public school system. And so sometimes people can flounder just a little bit, but like, that doesn't mean that you're disqualifying yourself from graduate school because maybe that type of thing appeals more. I feel like having done both were complete, like just, in their own way, super valuable. But I
Mhm.
think just the way that my brain works, I think I'm kind of more of that undergrad person, because I'm always like, oh, there's just another thing I want to learn about that, like maybe I'm not advanced enough in it to contribute to research, but I'm just like so curious. Like I could probably go back and get like 10 bachelor's degrees if I wanted to, or if I could, because I think film was the right choice for me, but I could have gone for psychology, sociology, graphic design, English. And so, but you'll never be that age again. And at the time, I had a lot of, I wasn't a full adult, so I didn't have to work full time and stuff
Right.
like that.
All those responsibilities
Yeah.
bearing down on you.
Yeah. But if somehow I could make it work, I would just, be a perpetual sort of student. But a master's degree kind of is a way to do that a little bit for people. Another kind of benefit, I feel like, or reason why people sort of choose to pursue it, is to take that sort of pause from their career in terms of like their workplace and work life or work responsibilities, to kind of invest in themselves and give themselves that time and that kind of gift of an educational enrichment. And with that said, though, a lot of people don't stop working while they're in a master's degree. Like I worked full time. It sounds like
Same here. Yep.
you're working full time, and so it's not like life pauses so that you can do that. For some people it might, but it is something that's doable even if you can't entirely pause everything else. But it is something you can do if you need that pause a little bit. You can kind of rearrange things and maybe find ways to fund your education or get support so that you can kind of like invest in yourself, whether you have a family to support or you're like 10 years into your career or anything like that. Or, some people go right into graduate school after undergrad. And so it's fairly young. I think I started when I was 24. And so I didn't realize that was relatively sort of young. Having talked to some graduate students recently, it sounds like a lot of times graduate students are more in their 30s or late 20s. And I remember at that time having gone to a 9-to-5 job that was sort of like I could use some of my creative skills, but there was sort of an admin, staff administrative support sort of aspect to it. And I had this kind of like agreement or pact with myself that I wasn't going to lose sight of my creative process and my creative vision. And so being able to be in the MFA program and work on that and keep that central and have deadlines with that and mentors and, and be a part of a graduate program community with other students was able to keep that on my mind instead of entirely just having studied film, done some creative work in film and directed a couple short films when I was a student, and then just moving right into like a staff job that I wasn't focusing on my own creative work, I guess. And so being able to do the MFA at that time was like I got to carve this piece out for myself. So that was really cool. And then on the question itself about what is a graduate degree, another thing I should mention is that typically a graduate degree too, it's maybe not in all cases, some are kind of practitioner type degrees where it's like qualifying you with a license of some sort, but some or many, and if not close to all, have some sort of component where you're writing a thesis, a dissertation, or a project. Some degrees are non-thesis, type of degrees, but a lot of times what's expected in a graduate program in general is that you would be contributing to that body of research or into your discipline in a way that's not quite as expected as an undergrad, although some undergrads do theses, some do research, and some do capstone culminating projects and portfolios. So that's kind of an interesting challenge sometimes for graduate programs, is this sense that in undergrad you might be writing a paper or doing a quiz or a test, or sometimes it's your culminating psychology exam, and it's very high stakes, very important, but that's not necessarily going to be published for the public. And so that can sort of be a difference between the two in that way too, that people are feeling like, I'm entering public life through my contribution to this field. So that's a bit of a convoluted way to get to that answer, but it's definitely something I learned, and a lot of people sort of learn as they're doing it, that you're expected to kind of contribute to the field in a way that's not quite as expected in undergrad.
I want to talk more about your own graduate school journey. But before I do, I want to touch on something that you brought up earlier. You mentioned, not necessarily having to have kind of that end goal in mind while you're in graduate school. Imagining that there is one. I talked a little bit earlier about how for a lot of people that end goal is just career advancement. So can you talk a little bit about what that end goal could be for someone in graduate school? Like how could a graduate degree help advance you in your career? And what are some of the other end goals that people might have in mind with a graduate degree?
Good question. For me, primarily it was to center my creative mind and not lose sight of that as I kind of was building in responsibility in my own life. And then, so that might be something that other people might feel, and that I feel like for a lot of the people that were in my program, I think a lot of them, they loved writing. They had this story to tell. This was something they were doing as a personal practice, but they needed that rigor and they needed the almost the accountability,
Hmm. The
and
deadlines.
the deadlines, the mentorship, and just sort of a container, if you will, in order to complete that book or that goal, and or figure out what that goal even is. When you're in the degree, you probably can't wait too long to figure out what that goal is. Like for me, like I changed the subject of my thesis like 5 times. But for others that might not be in the creative disciplines as much, or the specifically like MFAs, it might be honestly that they're not ready to leave school yet. They might feel at home at UAA or at their current undergrad school and they're approaching graduation or they just graduated, and they might feel like I've looked out there and I don't know if I'm ready to join the workforce in the way that it currently is presenting itself to me.
Mhm.
And so they might just kind of decide that the path of continuing or quickly returning to school might make sense for them. It might be that somebody studied something in undergrad that was adjacent to what they kind of really wanted to do, and then they want to pinpoint that subject a little bit further, although they're not really sure what that outcome or goal is going to be, or they want to combine their undergraduate experience with a master's experience, then that will then be attractive to employers or attractive to getting grants or living sort of like an artist's creative sort of life. It may be a specialization like to become a principal,
Mhm.
if they're already a teacher or something like that, or there's actually a graduate certificate that's new at UAA called Indigenizing Education, which is
Mhm.
really neat, because it's very place based and like culturally relevant to Alaska. And so somebody that pursues that, maybe their goal is to, get that certificate, and maybe that does lead to some sort of career advancement, but they might have more of a sense that they want to enrich their service to Alaska as a teacher or somebody in public education or like an indigenous leader, with being able to study that specific subject on a higher level and maybe be able to work with experts and knowledge holders that they admire, that work in the program, that type of thing. I mean, there's so many different reasons somebody could do it, and it's like I guess the idea is that it's probably not going to be black and white. It's not going to be like, I have no idea what I'm going to do. I'm just doing it and it's going to be completely different than I thought. And it's probably not going to be purely, I know exactly what I'm getting into. It's going to turn out exactly the way that
Mhm.
I wanted it to. And at the end, it's going to be in service of this specific goal. It's usually for people somewhere in the middle where it's like, I discovered something new here, even though I had this outline goal. And then for others, it's going to be like, I was able to kind of focus and specialize a little bit more and maybe like get a credential out of this that I didn't really expect to, even though I was just dipping my toe in the water a little. But it's kind of a
Mhm.
cool thought experiment to be able to consider like how people come to this decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What really interests me, the people that know that they are going to be going to grad school like from the very beginning, and I find that those are the people that who are pursuing careers where you and I, we both went into grad school kind of gradually, but for some people, like they know they want to pursue a career that the floor is you have to have a graduate degree. And I find that is very common in like the STEM fields, like engineering, you have to have a graduate degree, or the legal fields or the medical fields, like you have to have a graduate degree before you're able to pursue. So for someone to know early on that that's what they want to do and are dedicated at such a young age, to know that they have to commit to undergrad and then graduate school and then possibly doctorate after that, is so wild to me, that they know that they're going to have to commit like right away to doing all of that. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
that's definitely, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even really considered that. It definitely has to be some people's trajectory that they're planning for a long time. If they are like, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, they kind of, you can't do that without a graduate degree. And then there are other paths too to shoot for that bullseye, and but maybe land on something similar like a nurse practitioner. Some people become a physician's assistant, which those still require a graduate degree, but they're not quite the as much commitment as like some of the other ones. And so that's what's kind of nice about it too, is that people can adjust depending on, what happens in their life. But you're right, it's something that I admire, in that like I can't quite grasp how somebody could have that lined out so well in their minds, because I swear, like, I could change my mind every, 5 minutes about what I really want to do. And that's a different type of approach to it, to kind of know what your timeline is going to look like and exactly what you need to do to get there, because some master's degrees require prerequisites and or some demonstration of your knowledge in the field, or they might even require that you have the specific major in that in your baccalaureate degree in order to enter the program. And sometimes it's conditionally like, oh, you don't have a psychology undergrad, but you do have these courses and you just have to take a couple bit more and then we can admit you to the program. But some, it's kind of like, you have to have that specific degree. Like, for a lot of times, teachers need to have a degree in something that's a core subject on the K-12 level and stuff like that. But I always kind of look at it like there's always a way. Because I think a lot of institutions, especially UAA, they want to support students to get to their goal. And so if you have sort of the potential, you might not, like, let's say you want to further or let's use me as an example. I studied film, right? So film isn't a subject that's typically taught in K-12. And let's say I wanted to become a teacher, and the teaching credential program sort of expects you to have a baccalaureate degree in English or something that's sort of like taught on the K-12 level. Some people might see that and say, oh, well, I'm disqualifying myself from doing that. I probably shouldn't, go down that route. But I feel like if you just like, ask the program or ask an advisor, they might be able to say, oh, you have a film degree, but look, you took these English courses, and if you just take a couple more, then you can pursue this program. And I think it's helpful for people I think some people have a bit of an imposter syndrome, or they might not feel like academia was like ingrained in them. And so they might self-disqualify before somebody else can disqualify them. And I've found that at times, people that are really into like reading the policies and following the rules and things like that, like, they're important, and the catalog, is really important. But it doesn't hurt to ask, because you might be able to be conditionally admitted to something that didn't seem like a possibility before, because state supported university like the University of Alaska wants people to graduate with these credentials in order to serve as a teacher, a doctor, an artist, in Alaska or elsewhere. Yeah, it's interesting sometimes when those like barriers or those roadblocks come up and how people respond to them. But I've learned in my experience to try not to pre-disqualify yourself from graduate education or really anything else, because there's other people out there that wouldn't give it a second thought and are just asking and just seeing what can be done and how flexible requirements can be and stuff like that. And so I feel like we need people like that in graduate education too, and pursuing graduate school too, who don't always, they might hesitate before they enter into something like that. So maybe don't let the hesitation stop you, I guess, would be like sort of my thought on it.
How can someone tell if they are ready for graduate school?
It's funny because it's like it's sort of it's not quite the same stakes or the same question, but like sometimes people will talk about like, how do you know you're ready to be like a parent, or how do you know that you're ready to move to a new city or get married or just make these like big decisions that have financial and other consequences, or it could be have benefits that could come your way and stuff. So it's like maybe hard to know exactly if you're ready, because you might not know until you get your feet really wet and you're in the middle of it, and you might be like, oh, my head is underwater a little bit here. But I think in general, it helps if you have a why that's very personal to you, and that sort of that reason and that motivation will not be kind of a moving goalpost about oh, your employer might pay you a little bit more, something that is not entirely in your control. But if your why is and your reasons for going to graduate school are still central to, like, no matter what the outcome of it is, it's not based on a future that you can't entirely predict. Where, for me, so the MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, is considered a terminal degree in that discipline. And so, although, it's creative writing, it's poetry, it's essentially for me for like artistic and creative development and that sort of thing, I also knew that it would be something that would qualify me to teach college in creative writing, English, those types of disciplines. Typically, those types of jobs in English or creative writing will require a terminal degree at a certain level, like a PhD or an MFA. It'll say, that's what the baseline requirement is. And so that's, something that I'm qualified to do. However, a lot of times for creative writing jobs in particular, they're looking for a major publication along with that, that shows kind of in the same, maybe the equivalent would be for other types of disciplines, like a lot of contribution to the body of research. And so that's a kind of a far off goalpost for some people, because they're thinking, for me, I'm thinking, okay, so if I want to do that, I have part of the requirement, but if I really want to be hired, I might need to have a book published first, or like a significant amount of publications of my creative writing first before that's really feasible. And you're competing against other people that might, have those sort of attractive qualities and might be further along than you. And so if I were to only go for that degree based on that outcome, then it would feel like I might not have the sort of engine behind it to kind of complete it, because it is challenging. It is challenging to finish graduate school. But if it's based on sort of an outcome that you can't entirely control or might be far off in some way, then it might not be enough to complete or enter into the experience. So it's kind of important to keep those things in mind, but also have something that tells you you're ready, that's more central to you, and not something about kind of, I don't want to call it a fringe benefit, but something that's like external to you that you might achieve with this degree. That could be good for people to kind of like reflect on. And then, I always sort of thought, like, if you really loved school, like if you really loved undergrad, then, and you love academia and you just love to learn and like you feel comfortable in school, and it makes sense to you. Like for me, I think I just have to write this paper and then I get a grade and then I move on to a new thing. And it's like in these short chunks of an experience, where for me, like a job or a workplace is just sort of like ongoing with like lots of different projects that are all in different points of completion or development and everything. And so that's what appealed to me about academia. But it sounds like for you, you felt like you didn't quite experience that in undergrad, but you still went on to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you still went on to pursue graduate education. So again, people shouldn't be disqualified from pursuing it just because they felt like maybe undergrad wasn't quite what I expected. And you wouldn't want to limit yourself from past experiences and everything. Like I definitely had some missteps in my undergrad, but being able to feel ready to enter into graduate school, even with those missteps, it is a good thing to be able to determine with yourself, because it's not something you can be half-hearted about. At the end of the day, you can get as much support and faculty guidance and, deadlines and accountability and that container and that external motivator as possible. But you're the one that has to, apply, everything you have to it at the end of the day. That can be very challenging for people that are like neurodivergent, I feel like, too. They may rely on those external motivators to kind of like, get things done and everything. And so sometimes people that have differences in their psychology might also have trouble feeling fully ready. But
Mhm.
I guess the answer is you can't know that you're fully ready. Maybe that's like the real answer to it.
Let's talk
Mhm.
a little bit about the UAA Graduate School. So, can you tell me about what programs are available here?
Yeah, so the graduate school itself, like as a unit, it's somewhat of an administrative unit. We process a lot of we process like the approvals for theses and projects and dissertations and like final graduation requirements, and work with the any school or college at UAA that has a graduate level program in it. And so I describe it a lot as the connective tissue of graduate education, where the colleges themselves are providing the degree or the program. Like the College of Arts and Sciences, for instance, has an applied anthropology degree and a biology degree, and then the College of Engineering, College of Education. They're where the program is housed, but we're sort of that connective tissue, both internally and externally, sort of, for students, staff, faculty, and prospective students, many of whom are undergrads currently at UAA. And so we have that support function, but then we also have sort of central functions beyond the academic and administrative side of things. So a lot of what I do is like producing communications like newsletters and the website and kind of emails and things like that to keep graduate students informed on the life side of things, less than the administrative side of things.
Mhm.
We do like advising, but not in the formal sense because advisors are typically faculty members that are in those programs themselves, but we do more of like a catch-all support or like a landing place for prospective and current students who are like finding that they're kind of getting falling through the cracks or getting lost in the fray, or they want help deciding, what to go, where to go next.
Mhm.
And then we also support like events and community building opportunities like our graduate school fair, where students can talk to programs and other student services and us on campus about graduate school. And then we do professional development for faculty and students, which sometimes the professional development takes on sort of the role of like a panel or just an open discussion more than like in particular like a professional development where we just teacher teaches and the students learn, but more like just an open discussion. And sometimes they end up, depending on how many people show up, they can be kind of like somewhat of a one-to-one support office hours sort of a feel. And so we do kind of like community building, social programming a little bit. Like we have an orientation and a tour at the beginning of the fall and spring semesters, and we did like a graduate student social last fall. It's a small but mighty team. We have kind of built up a lot of those things in the last couple of years to make the graduate student experience a little bit less isolated, because it can be quite a bit more isolating than undergrad. People are somewhat siloed into their projects, and it's more of an individualized study for the most part, or some programs are more individualized than others. And people are typically older and they have other things going on and other competing responsibilities. So we're trying to offer space for students to connect with each other and connect with us. And so that's sort of what we're trying to lean into and be very responsive to student needs, and and receive feedback. We have a coffee with the dean event where students can come and have snacks and coffee and kind of like talk with us and ask questions or share, struggles that they're having, and hopefully get that support from us. So that's kind of the graduate school, which is a certain entity. And one other thing is that we house the interdisciplinary programs under our kind of umbrella. But graduate education at UAA is, like I said, in almost every college and school. There are programs in engineering, nursing, education, the College of Arts and Sciences, business. And a lot of these programs some are on campus, some are hybrid, some are fully online. And then another kind of feature of our graduate level education is that all of our graduate degree programs, master's and doctoral, are eligible for the Western Regional Graduate Program, which allows a student to pay in-state tuition even if they're out of state for all of our programs that are degree programs. And another feature of UAA that allows flexibility for people is that 100% of online courses are at the in-state tuition level. And so people might be able to get that in-state tuition, even from out of state if they access it online. Or some of those courses are at the tuition is at the in-state level. So there's also accelerated degrees. So a couple programs you can kind of combine your bachelor's with your master's and save I think about a year of time and the associated tuition costs, some of the associated tuition costs and fees and things for that time, because it's combining the bachelor. It's kind of like a continuum between the bachelor and the master's degree. So those are our accelerated programs, so we have those too in certain disciplines. And then there are also collaborative programs with other universities, where the degree is conferred by the other university, but UAA offers the support to those students and the access to things that they need on campus. And it's kind of like probably some sort of a memorandum of agreement sort of between the two schools.
Like our medical school.
Exactly. The WAMI program is a perfect example of that, and that has produced, like great results as far as I've seen over many, many years. And then there's also an occupational therapy program. There's a physician's assistant program, and so these are with schools that are in the lower 48, and there's a pharmacy program. And so that's really great too, because some people, want to stay in Alaska. They love Alaska. They want to work in Alaska and they want to be in these fields. But due to, Alaska being somewhat remote, sometimes those types of programs may not be able to be fully supported on their own here. But, as everybody who lives in Alaska knows, we have a need for medical providers and teachers and lawyers and, things like that. And so sometimes those collaborative programs can lend to Alaska sort of a qualified workforce that also has a love and a will to stay and a love for Alaska and a will to stay here, and maybe a lot of cultural knowledge or like long-standing understanding of kind of differences in Alaska too. And so those are kind of like unique features that UAA has. And then so our interdisciplinary degrees are another kind of cool thing where you can kind of design your own degree. It has to just combine two disciplines that we already offer, sort of. And so we've seen students graduate with an Arctic security degree, and then we had a student graduate with an interdisciplinary degree in essentially museum curation, which is really cool because there's not an existing program in museum creation, but there is a need in Alaska for that kind of work. And so this person took coursework from different disciplines in order to meet that need and also follow their own passion. So it's interesting because I think the interdisciplinary degree, it works for students who maybe are looking at the list of the kind of traditional degrees and might not quite be seeing something that fits for them right now. But it allows them to still stay with UAA or be at UAA or stay in Alaska or Anchorage and pursue the degree that in the discipline that they want. Mm-hmm. And so I've considered that there is still sort of a way for students to get what they want and need out of an interdisciplinary degree when no other degree really exists at that time for them. So it's another flexible kind of path.
And the interdisciplinary degrees are so unique in that I feel like they mirror real life in a way that something more focused just doesn't realistically do. You talked a little bit about the Arctic security degree and how we have a graduate this semester who's earning that. And I had the chance to talk to him, and his degree combined public policy with indigenous studies and, economics, and like basically pulling from almost every college here at UAA. And that is just so much more, I think, indicative of how real life operates, because rarely are things so siloed or rarely are things so compartmentalized. Like everything is in concert with something else. And I really admire how the interdisciplinary degree really emphasizes that relationship between all things, really.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, you basically just summarized it perfectly. How it's kind of a degree for like a new age of interconnectedness, and it's sort of functioning as a thing that, although some disciplines do feel very siloed, it's almost impossible that other disciplines wouldn't kind of commingle with each other, because
Mhm.
it's like when you're writing a paper, you're using English skills to do so, that type of thing. But you're right that, like, sometimes the disciplines can be, I don't want to say prescriptive, but they're essentially lined out for a
Mhm.
certain outcome, where the interdisciplinary degree can help people who are sort of curious about multiple different things. And it does mirror the way that problems and issues and solutions work in real life and in people's careers, where like it's rare that some issue that is out to be solved by people who want to solve those problems in Alaska or or in our country or in the world. It's rare that they wouldn't have that interconnectedness with other things, or like you said, wouldn't be in concert with other things.
Mhm.
And then it's also seeming like it's I feel like it seems like workplaces and employers are increasingly interested in that interdisciplinary view of things, like technology being intersecting with a number of things,
Mhm.
or the arts intersecting with a number of things. I feel like it could also advance people's careers in that employers are interested in sort of that interdisciplinary view. And in particular, for like the Arctic security degree, that is interdisciplinary, but it's somewhat lined out, or it has sort of a study plan
Mhm.
that has certain requirements and things like that. Like that is a perfect example of the confluence, if you will. Is that the right word? The confluence of different concepts of, I mean, there's food security, there's climate change, or just the environment, there's government and political science in there, economics, indigenous perspectives, that type of
Mhm.
thing, some of the things you mentioned earlier. And so that degree might allow a graduate to solve a problem, or address or come up with a solution for something that another degree might not quite give them the experience to do, because it was maybe limited in its scope or something like that. So
Mhm.
it's really cool, and it's really awesome to see. We have like a handful of graduates every semester with an interdisciplinary degree, and I always like to see what they studied, because it's like I'm kind of curious about like what their subject was, and then how they built that with some of the existing curriculum. And I think there was a student that studied wildfires or something like that. So it's always kind of like you can tell that it's people that are very rooted in what's happening in front of them. And as we said earlier, that like master's degrees are somewhat more specific than undergraduate degrees. Somebody's subject of interest might just be that specific that they're like, this is where I'm at, this is where my passion's at, or this is where I've been working in this space for a long time,
Mhm.
and I want to apply this degree to that work in some
Mhm.
way.
What did you love most about your grad school experience?
I feel like the faculty that I worked with and got to meet, and who were at that time like dedicated to advancing and editing and guiding my creative work. Like you almost never get that specific and dedicated of an editor or a reader of your work. People who pick up a book in a bookstore are reading it as an audience member, but they're not, helping shape and build it. And then people, you could ask people to, read through and edit your work, but typically, I guess I'm working with this concept that Stephen King has about having a reader of your work in your life.
Mm.
And it's just sort of rare that somebody would like take on that role as one of your readers that's really going to like sit down with you and sort through all that work. And so I feel like in my time there, I had mentors and I sort of met those people that, sort of believed in my work when I didn't know exactly what it was. And also just kind of the time to be able to dedicate to something like that, because I had always, been a bit of a creative writer, but I had never like carved out that much time and space, and I never had like a huge deadline with it. And so sort of the ability to take myself seriously a little bit as a writer and explore in that way, and really like pull a lot of work out of me. Like I said, I don't write for length typically, but I just had to because that was a part of the program. So yeah, I think that was kind of it. And then we had a really we had an aggressive reading schedule. Like we had to read a number of books a month, and so it made me a more attentive but more efficient reader of other writing, and it caused me to realize that there's a real relationship between being a reader and a writer that I wasn't seeing as much before, where you can build your abilities in craft and creative writing just by reading other people's work and stuff. And sometimes if you can't quite get where you're trying to get to with your writing, it's important to know and be in conversation with the genre and the body of work that kind of came before you and things like that. And then another thing was that it was a low residency program, and that might sort of mirror the way that some of our like flexible online programs work for people now, where it was mostly like I was not on campus at UAA. I was in my hometown working and running around being crazy and stuff like that too. And we would convene in the summertime for about 2 weeks. And so I think about it, and if it weren't for that ability, I wouldn't have been able to do it because I would have had to pause one or the other, working and being in Kotzebue, living in Kotzebue, or the graduate degree. But because of the way that it was structured, I was able to do both. And so I feel like UAA still offers degrees that kind of like do work for people that way, so they don't have to pause everything. And then it felt like small, like I wasn't in a sea of students that in a way that like caused me to fade into the background. Like every mentor I had gave me a lot of specialized guidance and things like that. And I think that's something that a lot of UAA graduate degrees still kind of have that feature to them, is that they're smaller and not as overwhelming, and very place-based and community-oriented and stuff like that. And so although creative writing is different than my work as a communication specialist and some of my other work in communications in the past, I do feel like the skills that I built in the program allowed me to gain confidence in my like editorial voice and my storytelling abilities, and in some of my roles that I've had. And so you might be able to relate to this too, but as a communications person, like you have to be looking for those stories within the story. And sometimes there are stories that are told that they might not pull on exactly the right threads, And so I think being able to hone my abilities in writing in that way allows me to pull on more meaningful and authentic threads in some of the like storytelling, no matter the storytelling in my communications work, no matter what shape that takes, whether it's social media or just, it just feels like, oh, it's just an email, but you have to be intentional about what, who your audience is and what threads that you're kind of pulling in all of your communications, sort of in order for it to be successful and meaningful and like really land well with the people that you're speaking about and speaking to. So I do think that it like lent me a new ability in the work that I do for employers at this point in UAA at the graduate school. So
what is one bit of advice you would give to someone who is thinking about pursuing graduate school?
I would basically tell them to just go for it, just ask questions. don't, like I said earlier, don't pre-disqualify yourself from it because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, nobody in my family has ever gotten a master's degree before. That might be something that somebody says, and that's something we talk about sometimes in our professional development events, that it seems like a small thing, but sometimes people's social environments aren't as conducive to somebody's advancing their education as others. It's actually a real thing that people experience sometimes. Or people might not feel like, if they're from a lower socioeconomic class or a place that's not particularly lended towards academia, they might think, well, I don't really fit there. But I think increasingly institutions like UAA and universities and colleges in general, they should and do, and hopefully will more in the future, just create like a wide and wider tent for people. And so that's what I think I would tell somebody is like, maybe question your disqualifying yourself or saying like, well, I don't know if I could really do that, or I don't know if that's like quite right for me, or I'm not sure if I fit there, because you might be surprised like who else you meet that has the same background as you, or they seem like very well educated and credentialed and stuff like that, but they might have, humble beginnings of their own, and you just wouldn't know that until you kind of like dipped your toe in the water. So that's what I would say is don't pre-disqualify yourself from entering into it, because as long as you have that baccalaureate degree, you're qualified to apply to graduate school, or you're nearing the completion of it. Yeah, I think it's kind of for everybody, and if not everybody, a lot more people than you would think.
Tiffany, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. It was awesome to be able to talk graduate school a little bit and reflect on such a long, long journey that I've had too.
Seawolf Voices is a production of the Office of Alumni and Community Engagement and University Marketing and Communications.